Hey guys, I'm Angela and welcome back to Hobby Night. Now, I had something a little bit different for us today because you see, I was browsing YouTube. I know, shocking, but when I'm not making YouTube content, I'm just watching YouTube content on other people's channels. It's ridiculous, I know. But I saw that Extra History, one of my favorite channels, actually had a really cool, very relevant history video that I thought we should watch together. You see, they did a history of board gaming, which is something that I love. I absolutely love board gaming. We haven't really talked about it much on the channel recently because we've been focusing on miniature painting and a little bit on Magic the Gathering, which I suppose is tangentially adjacent to board gaming, but doesn't really have a board. And so I thought this would be a great way for us to get back to talking about board gaming and also learn a little something. So without further ado, let's go ahead and watch the Extra History video.
The group of teenagers sits around the table, trying out a new game. And like any first play session, it's a bit of a fumble through. There
Oh my
are
gosh,
laughs,
yes.
rules clarifications, shouting, and excitement. Overall, a very similar experience to many of us, I'm sure.
Yep.
Except for one thing.
Definitely.
This group is playing in 1883.
Oh.
The game is called Banking, a card game that simulates market speculation and investing. Each player borrows money from the bank, making
precursor to
leveraged
Monopoly?
bets, with the cards then deciding their fate. Now, the playstyle here is also new and different, actually wildly divergent in tone and subject matter from games they've played before, like Old Maid, The Mansion of Happiness, or Pope and Pagan, because those games are about moral values and instruction, whereas
I'm not sure that I've heard of the Mansion of Happiness and I've heard of Old Maid. That's actually still produced and published modernly. I think by, if it's not Mattel, it's some other like child-friendly specific board game company. They definitely still make it. I do not know the Pope. What was it called? The Pope and the let's go back real quick.
or Pope
Pope and Pagan. I've never heard of the Pope and Pagan. If any of you guys have, tell me about it down in the
and
comments.
Pagan, because those games are about moral values and instruction, whereas this is about naked capitalism. It's honestly like
Capitalism.
nothing they've ever played, and there's a good reason for that. For this is not a game that they bought. Rather, it's one created by one of the 16-year-old players at the table, George B. Parker,
Oh,
a man
that's
who has, literally, just changed the game.
Dun, dun, dun. If you guys have never watched Extra History, I highly recommend them. They have great
Thanks so
videos.
much to World
and you learn a
Anvil for
lot.
also changing the game with their awesome tools for creative people. Games are old. Like
Yes.
really, really, really old.
Video
Card
games,
games
no,
date back
but
to the
normal
Middle
games
Ages
like
at
board
least,
games,
and
tabletop
board
games,
games
yes.
like chess and backgammon are truly ancient. That's not even mentioning the royal game of In fact,
I love
archaeologists
Ur.
have discovered what appear to be game components in Turkey dating back 3,000 years. Then other
Ooh, I'll have to
games
look
like
into that.
word
That's cool.
games, guessing games, and drawing games probably date back earlier than that. Heck, we even have a list of games that Buddha supposedly would not play as they were distractions from his meditation. But
Wow.
what we consider the modern board game, one with theming or a story, where we move pieces around a board using a number generator like dice, that is a significantly newer invention. One of the oldest that we know of is a game that's gone by many names, but it's most popularly called The Mansion of Happiness. There's some evidence it goes back to Italy in the 1500s, and it was probably
I didn't
first
know.
published in Britain around
Wow, I
1800.
didn't know it was that old.
But it was really in the early Victorian era that its popularity exploded. And it's a game you're probably pretty familiar with. Okay, imagine this. Think of a board spiraling inward, where the players move via a spinner. If they hit a vice, like, say, drunkenness, they're punished by going to the whipping post. But if they land on a virtue like perseverance, they advance. To win, they need to get to the center of the board, where a heavenly vista of gardens and a great mansion await, for they
Sounds a
have
lot like
lived
life,
a
doesn't
good
it?
life and reached heaven. Give up on what we're talking about? That, my friends, is the game of life. Yep, pretty
I
much
called
the
it.
exact one you played as a kid, only with Victorian Protestantism as its basis. How about another one?
yes.
The classic Snakes and Ladders. It's always been played the same way, but in the original, ladders were virtues while the snakes were vices. And there were no choices in these games. Players' fates were controlled by the will of God, represented by number generators like dice. Because
My goodness.
Victorian-era games were less about fun and more about moral instruction. See, throughout the 19th century, there was a growing recognition that childhood was a distinct period of life, one that was important for the ethical and intellectual shaping of people. This realization impacted a great deal, from the passing of child labor laws to founding public education and expanded leisure time for many children. Play itself was also considered a kind of training. Toys not only defined gender roles of the time and their expectations,
Oh my God, did
baby
they?
dolls for girls, lead soldiers for boys, that sort of thing, they also set expectations
soldiers,
about
by
the
the way.
lives children were preparing
Not great.
for. And board games were a popular tool for this kind of instruction through play. None more so than the Mansion of Happiness, which by the
'Cause everybody wants
1840s
to
was
get to.
being published
We
by
all
the
wanna be in a
W
mansion
and
of
S. B.
happiness, right?
Ives Company of Salem, Massachusetts. For Massachusetts was, at the time, the center of America's burgeoning tabletop game industry. In fact,
Really? I
another
actually
Salem
did not know
resident,
that.
a minister's daughter named Ann Abbott, became America's first great game designer. Heck yeah.
Whoa! Whoa, wait, a woman was America's first great game designer? That's actually super cool, and I had no idea. Also, I didn't know Massachusetts was, like, the game hub of America at the time, because, like, I really associate it, honestly, with Indianapolis, just because that's where Gen Con is, and I kind of assumed there were roots there somehow tied to, well, I guess, like, I think Gygax had roots there with, like, cons and everything, so maybe that's what it is. But, like, I really just kind of associated with that. I didn't realize that it was, like, a completely different state, which is pretty cool. All right, let's continue, obviously.
Over her life, she authored 3 games, but her smash success was called Dr. Busby and His Neighbors. It was a memory game where players tried to create matching suits of families by asking other players if they had certain cards. Dr. Busby sold 15,000 copies within the first 18 months of its release in
That's
1843.
great for
Those
that
were
time.
monster sales for the time.
Yeah, like,
considering
holy
the
cow.
US population was only 17 million. That equated to roughly 1 Dr. Busby deck for every 1,100 Americans. These specifically
Holy
designed card
cow.
games also eliminated the moral objection to standard card decks, which New Englanders associated with gambling and fortune-telling. Ives' main corporate competition, though,
Both
was
terrible,
Milton
terrible
Bradley,
things.
another Massachusetts game publisher who broke into the market big in the 1860s when he realized that bored Union Army troops needed to occupy themselves during any downtime in the Civil War.
They needed
His
something to
solution
do.
was the first mass-produced portable game case containing chess, checkers, backgammon, dominoes, and his own, more secular version of the Mansion of Happiness, which was renamed
Which is really funny, actually, to see, because, they still make combo little game packets like this that include chess, checkers, backgammon, and not as oftentimes dominoes anymore, but they do still make some that come with dominoes. So this concept still exists, it's just that the game of life is not included.
the checkered game of life. In this version, instead of heaven as a reward, now the win state was happy old age. But overall, these games
Yay.
were still considered moral instruction tools. In fact, in all of its copies of the Mansion of Happiness, Ives eliminated dice, which Americans considered dangerous and inappropriate for children since they too could be used for gambling. So instead, he packaged it with a dreidel-like top called a teetotum and later a spinner. Yeah,
That's where
the
the spinner
real reason all
derives
those
from.
games you grew up with had a spinner instead of dice wasn't to reduce choking hazards, it was to stop you from shooting craps, which I'm sure worked for some of you. But in meetings
That's definitely
with his
what all
gaming
the kids
group
were
in the
doing. We were just all
1880s, the
really
teenage
jonesing to
George
shoot
B.
craps.
Parker started formulating a different philosophy of play because he couldn't care less about using games for moral instruction. No.
No,
He
they
thought
need to be
playing
fun.
games should be fun. He
Yeah.
foresaw a world where games were primarily entertainment products rather than moral instruction. Because games like the Mansion of Happiness, he argued, were dull. There were no choices for the players to make.
An argument that modern board gamers honestly still make today. It is genuinely a complaint I think modern board gamers still make of these games that were based off of these very, very old games, these Victorian era games, are kind of dull, even for kids sometimes. Like, they're not terrible up to a certain age group, I suppose, and you can definitely house rule them to make it so that you can have a lot more fun with some of these classics. But they are dry. They are dry experiences often, which is why I prefer modern board gaming so much more, because the theming and the mechanics and just the variety is so much higher.
Making every game repetitive. He wanted more games that could be endlessly replayable, like chess, where players could employ
Which
different
listen,
strategies.
I don't disagree
and he
with.
jettisoned the religious and moral themes in favor of something more contemporary and exciting, capitalism. His first game that we showed you at the beginning of the episode, Banking, was all about stock trading. Players withdrew money from the bank, then made bets on what cards would come up. They wheeled and dealed across the table and would try to corner the market on different commodities. They shouted and swindled and occasionally teamed up to undermine other players. But perhaps banking's biggest difference was one of imagination. Because while games like Dr. Busby had an inherent element of humor in their cards and illustrations, the players were, fundamentally, outside the game. But in banking, you took on the personality of the stock trader, because role-playing as a ruthless tycoon was part of the fun. It became so popular with friends that he tried to interest the publisher. When they turned him down, he borrowed money from his parents to publish 500 copies himself and went on the road. When Parker got off the train in Boston with his mother's suitcase full of banking decks, he thought he might be able to make a few bookstores interested. But within 2 days, he returned home with the suitcase empty and realized he'd caught lightning in a bottle. Within months, he'd nearly sold his entire stock. He needed to form a company, and fast. By 21, he'd published 6 more games, 5 by himself and 1 designed by his teacher, with themes ranging from investing to famous people, battlefields, and Charles Dickens. And since he was never best at the business side of things, he brought in his brothers Charles and Edward to handle the money while he designed the games. And Parker Brothers was born. For years, George Parker, often with the help of his wife Grace, wrote the majority of games that the company produced, focusing on ripped-from-the-headlines titles like Klondike, themed around the Alaskan Gold Rush, and War in Cuba, published after the Maine explosion and during the feverish newspaper campaign leading to the Spanish-American War. Though George Parker was not above playing to the religious element in New England. As the company expanded, he bought Ives, and then began producing The Mansion of Happiness himself. Not to mention the couple's most successful game, called Rook, published in 1906.
I didn't realize Rook was quite that old, but again, another game that is completely still published and just has completely modernized packaging, because while this looks very cool, and honestly, I would love a retro version of Rook to come out. They definitely have modernized
Reinvented the standard 52-card deck into a 56-card version with no faces or suits, changing it just enough to make it acceptable to groups like the Mennonites that banned traditional decks. By the 1930s, Parker Brothers was one of the largest players in the game industry. Yet George Parker wasn't done. That decade, as Parker pushed into his 80s, his company adapted popular British games such as Sorry and Clue, and would acquire the rights to Lizzie Maggie's smash hit, Monopoly, before passing away in 1952. Wait, did you think that Parker Brothers created Monopoly? Actually, I did too. That is, until we made a whole additional episode on the insane history of everyone's favorite game not to finish. Real talk, I flippin' love Monopoly. And you can learn all about it right now over on the Extra Credits channel. The link to that is in the description or on screen after the upcoming credits.
I'm not sure I believe him.
Perhaps before passing go and collecting that $200, you might want to learn the secrets of staying out of creativity jail. Well, Extra Historian, you are in luck.
All right. Skip his ad here.
Pivot my session super fast without missing a beat, and not to worry, they'll get to that tipping and plot template. Truly a one-stop solution. Heck, Writer's Digest. If you want an easy way to create any of their premium memberships, we love these folks and we know you will too, so please fill for your own creativity. And once you signed up, check out the dirty secrets of Monopoly here.
All right, so that is the end of the video. Okay. I learned a lot from this, actually. I did not know that the Parker brothers... Well, I knew the Parker brothers actually, that company, did not create Monopoly. I actually knew that thanks to No Rules Barred. Because they did, I believe, a history video on Monopoly as well, which I highly encourage you to check out, because I missed that content from them. But I don't think it was doing super well compared to their Let's Play content, so that makes a lot of sense. But there's definitely some interesting tidbits in here about board gaming and how some of it came to light. I didn't realize Rook came from them originally. I actually thought it was either younger or much older, and then much like Old Maid was kind of in that era of gaming. So there's lots of interesting little things. Board gaming is just such a fascinating subject. I would love to know, just based on this, knowing that a lot of us grew up playing some of these either more classic games, or the, what is now owned by either Mattel and or Hasbro, because a lot of the classics all went to them, like Monopoly and Clue or Cluedo, depending on where you are, Trouble, etc. What was the game that you played when you were younger? And are you young enough that where Catan was your intro gateway board game that you played and sat around with your family and actually played as a kid? Because for me, it was definitely like Monopoly, Clue, Trouble, Candyland, all of those kinds of things, Snakes and Ladder, but it was all the Hasbro slash Mattel versions of these that were super kid friendly. They all had the pinwheels because heaven forbid there be dice. I like that the only, thinking about it, the ones that got away with having dice were Trouble because it was locked in the little like container, so you couldn't. I mean, I guess you could break it out, but you destroy the game, which is probably unlikely to have happen. And so they got away with being able to have dice in the game. Although, now that I say that, Monopoly also has dice, so they must have not cared at a certain point, which is very just like honestly a very interesting thing. Like I need to look up a little bit more about the history of the morality impacting board games specifically when it comes to like dice and gambling and people's association with that and how that changed kids games and even just adult games going forward and then when that reverted back. Like that would be really cool to like look into more. So I might. But I hope you guys enjoyed this run on a little bit of an educational look at where board gaming started, at least in the US, and how it kind of grew a little bit, talking about the Parker brothers, which I just think is really neat. And again, extra history, great channel, lots of great subjects covered, and they do a lot of board game and video game content as well on a couple of their other channels. So I'd highly encourage you to check them out. If you enjoyed this, make sure to give this video a like and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss when new content comes out. And before I head out, I do want to give a final thank you, not only to my patrons, but my YouTube members as well. You guys are awesome, and we would not be able to make content without your guys' support. So thank you very much for helping keep Hobby Night going. I have been Angela, and I hope you all have a wonderful Hobby Night. Bye.